person who hosted me for the interview was a legal scholar, a law professor. So he certainly knows something about law. And from that moment on, I understood that there is a problem here. From the moment go, I saw and heard things that are not in the literature and that evoked grave concern with me. This law professor told me that sometimes the second opinion that was mandated by the Dutch Royal Society of Physicians is performed by form. And I could not understand what he was saying. Because the role of the second opinion is twofold. One is to affirm that this is the voluntary independent wish of the patient. And secondly, to review the patient physically to see that she has the condition that the first physician said that he has, that it cannot be cured. It's irreversible, and the patient is on the verge of dying, and medicine cannot help. And now the law professor tells me that sometimes the second opinion is conducted by phone. So I said, sorry, phone between whom and whom? Who are this? Who speaks with whom? And he, the law professor, patiently explained to me, it's the first physician speaking to the second physician. So then I asked, how can this kind of phone conversation can confirm that this is the voluntary independent will on the part of the patient if the second doctor does not speak with the patient? And then the answer of the law professor puzzled me even further, because what he told me, he said, well, you need to understand the Netherlands is a big country, and it may take hours for the second physicians to come and visit the patient, and therefore, because of the shortage of time, they conduct this over the phone. I don't know how many people of you were in Netherlands. Netherlands is not a very big country. I mean, if we spoke about the United States, maybe, but no. So that kind of an answer puzzled me even further, that this is the rationale, the big distances that prevent physicians from traveling to secure and to affirm that this is the voluntary wish of the patient. So if this is the case, and what we are having is sort of phone calls between the first and second physician, this might open to abuse, because the second physician may confirm the euthanasia cases of the first physician and vice versa. And because apparently the great distances to travel are sufficient as an excuse, as a rationale for having this kind of policy on the ground, that evokes with me great concern. And the concern grew further and further as I met with people and I heard their explanations of what's going on. The vast majority of my interviewees supported euthanasia in the Netherlands. Only a small minority did not. To the extent that after a few interviews, I noticed that my interviewees are not critical at all of what was going on. So I pushed them and asked them more poignant questions about critique, because everything was fine in the Kingdom of the Netherlands according to them. The few people who were opposing the policy told me that they had a difficult time in the Netherlands They were dismissed as Catholics, fundamentalists, religious, anti-liberal, clerics, sometimes as clowns, don't know what they're saying, don't know what they're talking about, not versed with what's going on, aloof from reality. Very distinguished professors were dismissed as either clowns or Catholic fundamentalist. A preeminent professor, physician, told me, I'm secular. I'm not Catholic at all. But they tried to tag me as a Catholic because I oppose what they're doing. And then when this was not sticking, then they just dismissed me as a lunatic, as a clown who doesn't know what I'm saying. They try to isolate me and bypass whatever I said. And he explained to me, it's not that I oppose in principle euthanasia. It's simply because I saw how it's going on and how it's working. And I, doing this for myself, I oppose the policy for myself because at one point I'll be 75, I might be involved in car accident, I'll be rushed in the hospital, and the attending physician will decide that I should be euthanized. And then it's going to be too late for me to oppose and for my family to oppose because these people are too powerful. So after that summer of 1999, and it was a difficult summer for me because from morning till evening, I spoke about death, which is not a very, there are more attractive topics to discuss, I think. I was fortunate to spend the following year as a Fulbright scholar at UCLA School of Law. And I gave my notebooks to my secretary, who had this awful task of transcribing my quite difficult handwriting, hundreds of pages of them. It took her several months. And it was fine for me because I wanted to digest what was going on. You see, I entered into a cognitive dissonance. For 8 years, I've been preaching euthanasia. For 8 years, I've been saying euthanasia is something that I'm in favor of, that I would like to promote in liberal democracies. And now, during the summer, I've heard so many stories that I was not comfortable with, that my belief in euthanasia was cracked and then shattered. And I was reflecting on what was going on. I was writing a book at that time, The Right to Die with Dignity, which was essentially pro-euthanasia. And what was missing in that book was the chapter about Netherlands that I didn't write yet because I was waiting for the opportunity to go there. And now I realized that I have to change the entire thesis of the book from pro-euthanasia to be against euthanasia and to rationalize this thing. And once the transcription of my interviews was finished after a few months, I started to write. And I wrote like a frenzy. It was an eruption. I just collected all this information and put it together. And my intention was to have a chapter. But suddenly, I have more than 200 pages of manuscript based on the interviews. Because it is such a sensitive issue, I decided to write this thing, which I didn't know how to call it, whether it's a book or a lengthy chapter, or I didn't know where it's going to develop. But I decided to write it in such a way that will give a voice to my interviewees. So I was quoting them and saying what they tell me, and then provide the interpretation of what they're saying, because I still have a mind and I was reflecting on what they told me. But it was an eruption because I was compiling all this information and put it together in a meaningful way. And then have not only a chapter, but I have a full-fledged new manuscript. And I didn't know whether this is a book or not. because I've never written such a book in my life that is so heavily documenting interviews, that's so heavily relying on interviews. So I didn't know whether it's good, I didn't know whether it's bad. I thought it's interesting, but I'm not objective to this. You know, I'm very much engaged in this topic. I dedicated many years of my life to study this topic. So I didn't know whether it's good or not, and I didn't know whether this is a book. One of my friends at UCLA at that time was Professor Joyce Appleby from the history department. Joyce was a former president of the uh, American Historical Association. She's a very eminent scholar, very sharp mind, a person who I grew to appreciate a lot. And one day we're having our lunch together on yet another sunny California day. And I explained to her what happened. And I told her that I don't know to what extent I have a book here, whether this manuscript makes any sense, whether it's of any interest, or it's only because I'm so engaged in it that I found it fascinating. And then Joyce, who was a very kind woman, said, you know, Rafi, I am about to travel. I'm invited to give a lecture. And tomorrow morning, I'm about to fly. If you want, come to my house, drop the manuscript, and I'll take it with me during my flights. I'm returning on Monday, and then I'll give a talk. Perhaps I'll be able to finish this during my trip. Joyce knows nothing about euthanasia, knows nothing about Netherlands. So I asked her, are you willing to do this for me? She said, yeah, sure. And I'm always happy to learn. So don't worry about the fact that I don't know anything about this. It's good for you. And I agree that it's good for me because she will have an objective opinion of a very eminent scholar. So I brought the manuscript to her home, and she went away. And I was waiting for her phone call to arrive. It is Monday morning. The phone rings. It is Joyce. And Joyce tells me, I read your manuscript during my trip. Would you like to have lunch? And I said, of course. I said, okay, let's meet for lunch. So we met for lunch on yet another, there are many, sunny California day. And once we received our order and sat down, Joyce tells me, well, just to relieve from your anxieties, let me go just to the point. You have a book. These were her words. You have a book. And it was a great relief for me to know that someone like Joyce, who is not interested in the subject, found this manuscript interesting. And she said, I found it fascinating. All the reports that you've made, and yeah, I think it's really illuminating. It's really fascinating. I said, fine. Thank you very much. And that was encouraging. I promised my interviewees that they will have an opportunity to read the manuscript before it is published and to comment on it. So I abide by my promise, and I sent all my interviewees the full manuscript for them to read and to comment upon with a deadline until when they will be able to comment. And the majority of them provided further comments. I can tell you that the vast majority of them did not like the book because the book is highly critical of the Netherlands. It's one of the very few books that were published about euthanasia in the Netherlands. And like, I think most others, I mean, I think I read beforehand, there's a Gomez book on the Netherlands and there's a Hending book about the Netherlands. Both are very critical of the Netherlands. And this one, Euthanasia in the Netherlands, is equally, if not more, critical of the Netherlands. But it is based on what it told me. It is based on what these Dutch experts told me. So there you have it. So this is the book. It was published in 2004, and I want to tell you a bit about it. So at first, I'm opening the book with some background words about the three research reports that were issued by the Dutch government, ordered and then and then compiled with researchers. And these were published in 1990, 1995, and 2000. Three reports that were published up until the point that I was publishing this book. The book came out in 2004. And the interpretations of these reports. And then I give another background chapter about the practice of euthanasia and the legal framework. The second part of the book is the field work that I conducted in Netherlands. The chapter number 3 is about the methodology, in which I explain how I conducted the research. Chapter 4, I explain why the Netherlands opted to have this policy and practice of euthanasia. Chapter 5 is about views on the practice of euthanasia. So I collected what these experts told me, how they view euthanasia. Chapter 6 is presenting the worrisome data. So this relies on my previous research in the Hastings Center. I came there, as I said, in 1994, and I came back to Hastings in 1999 before coming to Netherlands. So a lot of the worrisome data is coming from that research at Hastings, and I'm thankful to Hastings Center for their kind of hospitality. Chapter 7 is about what Jan Remmelink contended and what the British say about this contention. Jan Remmelink was behind the first report, comprehensive report on euthanasia. Chapter 8 is about whether physicians should suggest euthanasia to their patients. I thought they should not, because it would compromise the patient's will. I mean, just think to yourself that a patient who is 80 years old, who knows his GP for 40 years, comes to the GP and the GP asks her, have you considered euthanasia? I mean, I thought euthanasia was well known enough for people to decide on it voluntarily of their own volition, and they should propose euthanasia to their physicians rather than the reverse. Because if your physician whom you trust for 40 years suddenly raises the issue of euthanasia, to what extent you are actually free, voluntarily free, with a free mind and free will to make up your choice? In what way are you going to perceive your physician from that day on if you don't believe in euthanasia? So that was a question that I wanted to pose to my interviewees, and I was baffled, quite surprised by some of the answers I can tell you then. Chapter 9 is about breaches of the guidelines, because, as I said, although there was no law, the law came about only in 2002, but the Dutch Royal College of Physicians had their own guidelines, and they were severely broken, all of them. All the guidelines were broken time and again. So it's about the breach of the guidelines. Chapter 10 is about the palliative care in the Netherlands, the importance of palliative care, and the Dutch culture that at that time was not very hospitable to palliative care. I can tell you that. And chapter 11 studies the legislation and the Chabot case, one of the few cases that appeared before the Supreme Court involving physicians who terminate the life of a psychiatric patient. And every psychiatrist outside of the Netherlands who knows the Chabot case would tell you that it was wrong. The way that Chabot conducted this affair was utterly wrong. Then I bring the general comments of the interviewees after I send them the manuscript. Then provide updates, because as I said, the book was for the large part, was written in 2000. It was published in 2004, so there was a gap And I filled this gap with some updates about a new act that was passed during the time, the work of the regional committees, and some further concerns that I had about the practice. So this is the book Euthanasia in the Netherlands that I told you about. And I think it's a fascinating read, and I think it's a very important read for anyone who would promote the idea of euthanasia. And we know that now there are several countries who are contemplating legislation, end-of-life legislation. I was involved in discussions in the Canadian Senate recently, and in citizen jury in the island of Jersey. They also think about promoting the idea of assisting dying in some form. So clearly more and more liberal democracies are contemplating end-of-life policies. And what I would like to plead with them, please have a look at this book before you make up your mind. Thank you.